And joining us now on the line from Montreal, Quebec, William Marsden. He is the author of Stupid to the Last Drop, How Alberta is Bringing Environmental Armageddon to Canada and Doesn't Seem to Care. And William Marsden, I guess I should start by congratulating you. You were the winner of the National Business Book Award this year, so congrats on that.
Thanks, Steve.
I want to start where your book starts, because you open with a most unusual scene. It's 50 years ago. There's an American geologist in the deserts of the Middle East figuring out how he might get oil out of the tar sands in Alberta, and the idea he came up with was to nuke it out. You want to explain that?
Yeah, his name was Manly Maitland, and he was a senior geologist for a company called Richfield Oil, which at the time had quite substantial leases in the oil sands, tar sands area in northern Alberta. He was watching a sunset in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, where he was doing some geological surveys. And the explosive nature of the sun as it went down suddenly gave him the idea of how to extract the oil from the sands. He would literally nuke them, in the sense that he would drill down a borehole of about 1,300 feet or more, up to 2,000 feet actually. He would plant a nuclear bomb at the bottom of this borehole, blow it. This would create a cavern, and the heat from the explosion would melt the bitumen out of the sands, which would fall into the cavern, and then you would simply pump it out. And it was in its simplicity, really, it was ingenious.
Did nobody think about the radiation fallout and how they might handle that while they're trying to find the oil?
No, at the time, Manly Maitland for Richfield Oil, he had tests done on this, and they discovered that just in the laboratory, nuking, say, a barrel of oil would really only produce the radiation of a wristwatch. But what happens in a laboratory cannot be generally applied to what happens outside in nature. And years later, they discovered that the Russians had done exactly this and done over, I think, 100 nuclear explosions underground to increase productivity of oil wells, etc. And most of the product, the oil, etc., suffered radiation, and it was almost unusable.
I think we're all under the assumption, as we look back at the history of oil exploration in this country, that it all must have started in Alberta. But in fact, you tell us in your book, it started in this province, in Ontario. Tell us the story.
Absolutely. It started in 1858 in the town of Oil Springs, where they literally dug down into the earth, because in that place oil actually seeped out of the soil. And you would find this in many places around the world, in the Middle East in particular, also in Pennsylvania, where it was discovered about 6 months after Oil Springs. In fact, Oil Springs wasn't just the first commercial well in Canada, it was the first commercial well in the world, and it created a Canadian oil industry where Canadians then went all over the world opening up oil fields.
Well, one of the places they went in the 1930s eventually was the province of Alberta. How'd they do when they first started exploring there?
Well, at the beginning, oil was actually discovered earlier in Alberta, but they quickly ran out and they were looking for new opportunities, and it took a while before they actually discovered the great sort of, not elephantine, but certainly large oil wells of Alberta, just south of Edmonton and in that area, and also south of Calgary, or actually west of Calgary into the foothills.
I guess it was not until 1947, though, that they made those huge strikes. And I guess you'd have to say that the entire future of our country changed on that day. How so?
Well, we became an oil economy in many different ways. It went up and it went down, but a lot of our basic revenues suddenly started gushing from the oil wells, etc. And it turned Alberta from a rural community into one of Canada's most aggressive economic environments.
61 years ago. Here's a name that you introduce us to. I think we've all heard the concept associated with his name, but I'm not sure we've heard of him. Marion King Hubbard. Who was he?
Marion King Hubbard was a geologist in the United States who first came up with the concept or theory, if you like, of peak oil. That is to say that, and it's very obvious, one day the world will run out of oil. But before that time, the world's reserves of oil will peak. And it'll basically be like a pimple. You'll see the oil reserves will go up and up and up, and then suddenly they'll reach a point where we simply start going down the other side. We don't have enough oil to meet the demand as demand grows. And he figured that in the United States, the peak would come in the 70s. I think it was 76 or so, and he was absolutely dead accurate. What he did is he basically took, by that time, and this was 1940s, early 50s when he came up with these theories, he was able to quantify through the mapping of the Earth, the geological mapping of the Earth, how much fossil fuels were actually in the Earth and how much could be extracted in an economic way. And so he simply used the math that he created, and he was actually dead on with the peak oil of the United States. It did peak when he said it would, and he's pretty well been accurate with what he thinks will happen for the Earth as a whole, except he has not taken into account the amazing escalation we've seen in the consumption side of it. So it'll probably come a lot sooner than he calculated.
Well, that leads to a quote that I want to read from your book and share it with you and our viewers. Here goes. As America measures its long-term energy security, the future, you say, is not promising. About 90% of the oil and gas is in countries that are unstable, corrupt, and hostile to American interests. At least 80% is controlled by Muslim countries, none of which cherish friendship with America. What's more, the expanding economies of countries like China and India are creating greater competition for oil supplies that will soon begin to dwindle. With such growing turmoil in the world's largest oil patches, it is no wonder that America's recent foreign policy has been all about oil, and more specifically, oil sands. Now, given that reality, can you blame the Americans for doing essentially whatever it takes to get their hands on what we've got in Western Canada?
Well, no, you can't blame the Americans for doing whatever it takes, not at all. What you can do is ask Canada about its own oil future. I mean, given the fact that we have already almost reached in this country the peak of our natural gas, yet we continue to sell 60%, I think it's even more now, of our product in natural gas into the United States. We do the same with oil. Over 60% of our product goes to the United States. We have to look at our own energy future. We're a cold country. As an American politician said to me, one day Canada's going to wake up and realize that it's a cold country. So we can't just be seeing 10, 20, 30 years down the road. We have to be looking generations down the road. We're not doing that. We've given it over to business. They set the trends, and we feed the American beast, which is another element that I find really puzzling in the whole book, is that given the fact that the Earth or the world is about to begin to run out of oil, and it could come 30 years from now, it could come 10 years from now, but that doesn't matter. It will come, this peak point. Why is it that this country just continues to not have any kind of an energy policy for its distant future, but continues to feed the voracious appetite of the Americans, which does not help anybody in the end? It doesn't help the Americans either.
Well, let me follow up on that question, because is there anything, let's clarify this because there's tons of speculation about this, is there anything that obligates this country under NAFTA to sell its oil and natural gas to the United States?
There's nothing that obligates it to sell its oil and natural gas to the United States, in fact, but once it begins selling it, which it has always done, then it runs into an obligation concerning NAFTA, that it has to meet those levels that it has reached. So, for instance, today, we'll use a figure of 60%. We sell 60% into the United States of every barrel of oil that we produce. We have to keep that percentage at 60%. So if we decide, for instance, we want to reduce our productivity, we still have to sell 60% of that reduced productivity into the United States.
Doesn't the GATT allow us not to do that if we get into critical shortages in this country?
Well, that is a question that is still out there. The GATT allows any country for national security reasons, to cut or reduce or what have you, their exports of a particular product.
So we should be fine then.
Well, I'm not so sure we're fine, because NAFTA could trump that. And you would have to also convince the Americans that, that we are doing it for national security reasons.
Well, you did talk to Peter Lougheed, and he was certainly under no illusions about this. He said we're fine. He negotiated it.
Yeah, he negotiated a contract. He would say we're fine. But he still could not really properly explain, and I think I point that out in the book, what kind of situation we are in if the Americans challenge us on this, which they will challenge us. We're the biggest importer of oil and gas into the United States now.
Let's talk about the environment. Your book does raise some very troubling questions about the environment, and I want to start by quoting David Schindler, whom you quote in the book, the well-regarded environmentalist at the University of Alberta. By the end of this century, he says, the southern half of the province of Alberta will be a desert. The northern half will be dug up for oil sands. The entire province will simply be a network of coal bed methane and in situ mining operations, most of which will have been abandoned. The forests will be destroyed by the pine beetle, forest fires, and clear cutting, and there won't be any water for anybody. So at the end of the day, you will have a pot of gold with no place to live except maybe the odd oasis. Now that is indeed a stark prognosis for the future of the province of Alberta. Is it possible he's wrong?
Well, to be fair to Dr. Schindler, that's actually, those are my words, and I asked him what his reaction was, and I think he said that that's pretty accurate. Is it possible that he's wrong? Well, you know, there's always a possibility that he might be wrong. If we continue to go on as we're going on, I don't think he's wrong. I don't think I'm wrong on that. Climate change maps, both in the, or climate change models, sorry, certainly show increased desertification of southern Alberta, which, by the way, this century is an oddity in the history of southern Alberta. It has more rain than it's ever had before in this century. The history of that province in the south indicates that they had droughts that sometimes lasted a century. So we could easily be going back to that, and the climate change models indicate that we will go back to that. So you will have a desertification. And also, most of the water that comes through Alberta comes from glacial activity, and the glaciers are melting because of climate change. The pine beetle is absolutely devastating the forests of BC, and they're beginning to devastate the forests of Alberta, and no one yet has found a way to stop them.
That's got nothing to do with oil drilling, though, does it?
No, that's climate change.
Right.
And you can reflect climate change on the fact that we're putting huge amounts of carbon in the air. And where does that come from? It comes from oil. And of course, the tar sands themselves are among the largest emitters of carbon into the earth in Canada.
What does all the drilling in the oil sands, tar sands, call it what you will, what is it doing to the health of those who live nearby?
Well, you know, it's polluting the rivers. It's polluting the Athabasca system. It's polluting the Athabasca Delta. You have incidences, according to the doctors there, because you know the studies have not been done, and Alberta simply refuses to do these studies of the health of the natives. You have a lot of incidences of cancer, of various thyroid cancers and sort of autoimmune diseases, etc., which are claimed to be caused by the kind of petrochemicals that come out of the operation of the oil sands, etc. This is what some doctors think. The problem is, of course, there is simply a lack of data and a lack of studies. And because Alberta will not look at these problems seriously, and I think it's because they're really afraid of what's going to come out of them.
So provincial health or provincial environmental agencies are not going to bat for local residents or for organizations who need their help on these issues?
No, not at all. And for instance, the local organizations which have been created by the government to protect people's health, to protect the environment, have had the mandate for quite some time now, I mean several years, to come up with a health study plan, and they haven't even started that. They haven't come up with this yet. And the sad part about it is that the people who finance these organizations, and there are 3 of them in particular, are the oil companies. And the people who control them are the oil companies. So it's certainly not to their interest to see these studies take place and to do proper monitoring of the environment up there and the impact that this has had on the flora and the fauna and the biosystems, all of which are incredibly important to this country and to the world, because the boreal forest is a huge carbon sink. No, we're just putting all of that aside, and we're just bashing on because we're making, well, actually investors are making so much money from the oil sands.
Well, you've taken me to exactly where I want to finish up, because in our remaining moments, we do have to explore the issue of whether or not there is simply too much money being made by too many different interests that, in your view, makes it absolutely impossible for anyone to consider any other narrative other than the one that we're currently involved with. Is that possible?
Well, I think you're right there. I mean, in my view, I'm I'm not optimistic about what is going on in Alberta, as I'm not optimistic about what is happening in the Western world today at all concerning climate change and the global chemical pollution that we've experienced so far. And that is because there's just too much money to be made out there, and the moneyed interests have such an incredible, powerful lobby. And of course the job interests also. I mean, what politician is going to stand up in Canada and say we have to cut back on the oil sands? You're not going to get any votes in Alberta.
But is that what you think is necessary?
And you're not, absolutely, it has to be done. I mean, there's just no question of it. We live under the illusion that we can continue to grow our economies and at the same time combat climate change. And we just can't do it. So sooner or later, we're going to have to bite the bullet. What really amazes me in all of this, Steve, is that I'm 57 years old, and I really won't experience the effects of climate change in my lifetime, probably not. But our young people will. But even they are not really seizing the moment to say, hey, we have to stop this. We have to create a new kind of economy, a new kind of economic theory that puts the environment first, that puts the welfare of the earth first.
Well, maybe they're not seizing the moment because they're flying in from Newfoundland and other places in the Maritimes to get these extremely high-paying jobs.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is the issue. It's jobs, jobs, and jobs. But I mean, we could cut back tremendously with the oil sands and still employ a lot of Canadians. Alberta just asked the federal government and got the federal government's agreement to import another 40,000 foreign workers into the oil sands. I don't think it's the job of this country to employ foreign workers.
But with oil at 125 bucks a barrel, there evidently is the sense that we've got to strike while the quote-unquote iron is hot, right?
Well, the iron will be hot for a long time. The oil is not going anywhere in the ground there, and nor will our need for oil be going anywhere in the next century or 2 centuries or even 3 centuries. So I don't understand why the rush.
Well, who do you expect to slow this process down, as you've described it?
Well, I mean, the only people who can slow it down, I mean, the federal government can slow it down. They certainly have the power to it. Albertans can slow it down. I mean, for Albertans, it's actually to their economic benefit to slow it down. Most of the money that they're making out of the oil sands is being eaten up by inflation, which is caused by the tremendous amount of the projects that are being put in there. I mean, when you're pouring $110 billion into an area like Alberta, you're going to create rapid inflation, and that's exactly what they've done. So, I mean, even their profits are being eaten up. It's really kind of pathetic that they do it for money, but they're not even getting the maximum profits that they should be getting out of it. Their revenues, their royalties are the lowest in the world. Even though they've raised them 20%, they're still lowest. And I noticed that as soon as the new government came into power, they reversed themselves on some of the royalty issues and promised to reduce them for deep well drilling, etc. So they're not getting anywhere near the amount of money they should. I mean, Kazakhstan makes more money out of its oil than Canada does. And I mean, the Norwegians absolutely shame us with the amount of money that they make out of their North Sea oil and gas industry, because they took control of it from an early stage. We didn't do that. We handed it over to private business to do with as they wish. And what they've done is they've gone up there, they've torn up the environment, they're destroying the boreal forest, they're destroying one of the most unique ecosystems in Canada at the same time. They're polluting the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, and they're taking all the money, and most of it's going to foreign investors. So it's a scenario that is absolutely mind-boggling. But you know what? The sad part about it is it's not unusual in this country. Most of our resources have been owned and operated by foreign companies, and that's where the profits have gone. All we've cared about is the day-to-day jobs that we get along the way. We can thank God that we have such a huge country, so we can simply move on from one rape of the environment to the next.
what may be unusual is that a book like yours did win the National Business Book Award in this country. And
Yeah.
I want to repeat the title for those who haven't heard about it or may want to read it. It's called Stupid to the Last Drop: How Alberta's Bringing Environmental Armageddon to Canada and Doesn't Seem to Care. William Marsden, we're grateful you joined us on the line from Montreal tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.